Okay, so in week 3, we're going to refactor what you did last week with the stimulus into having functions that handle particular aspects of the way you approached it. But in general, I could see you'd probably do a function that determines the check amount, and then another function that does something like handles your output. But you get to choose here. But in this process, I'm going to introduce you and we're going to extend again what you've learned with Andrew. This is the week I'm going to take you into the browser, because honestly, the one thing that if I could change about Andrew's course was that I'd move away from using the command line as soon as I could. And he does this later, so this is just a little preview. And the reason I do it is what I showed last week, which is that I believe by using the dev tools built into Chrome, and let me just say here, if you happen to love the ones in Firefox, you can use those as well. I'm going to show Chrome. It's typically the standard these days for JavaScript debugging. Again, you could use VS Code. I just find this easier. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm not, like I did last week, I'm not going to show you my code, but in the reply, I will do a separate video. Maybe you'll tell me if you found those helpful or not. I hope you did, but anyway, feedback there would be good. In my reply, I'll do a video going over my code. But what I'm going to do in this one is really show you how to set up an index file very easily with VS Code, how to link a JavaScript file. I give you a new name I want you to use for JavaScript files. And then I will also show you how we transition to the browser. Okay, so that's kind of like the part 2. So I'm going to focus more on the part 2 than I am on the part 1, because the part 1 is the part, and I say this down here on this submission, is I want you to, because part of what I'm trying to create here is a culture around students in this class that have an understanding that a really important part is learning how to troubleshoot, or learning how to think through analytically when you're approaching a particular task or problem. And if you just jump to looking at somebody else's code, you don't build that muscle. And part of what you're going to have to do for this class 3 times is you're going to write some code that accomplishes a specific task. I'll probably start talking about those requirements probably as soon as next week, because it's in week 6, I believe, right? So it's coming at us. But then you come in and you and I do a one-on-one code review. And part of what I'm looking for is, did you write code that worked? Could you talk about that code? Now, when you first hear something like that, could be a little challenging. And this is why doing each of these exercises and really utilizing as much as you can the forums to get help, and also just to come talk with me, or to somebody. Maybe you have somebody else in your life. I think a couple of you might. But if you don't, it's a great reason to come to office hours. Anyway, enough of that. So I'm going to take you through kind of how to do this from scratch. And as a way to help introduce Chrome DevTools, and I'll end up showing you another way that I don't know if I'll require this week. I'll kind of, as we go through, think about that. Okay, so hopefully I've helped you understand what we're going to do. So I'm going to flip over to VS Code, and I'm going to, now in your work that you'll do, you'll just take the code from week 2 and come over, and you'll see me do this here where I name the JS file a specific name, app.js, and then I create an index file. So to show you this, right, just from a how do you do it, is I've just created another W3 inside a demo. But again, yours can just go right off of your public repo. So in here in W3, I'm going to create a file. I'm going to call it index.html. Really good practice, lowercase, no spaces there. It just makes it cleaner, and the web doesn't like spaces, or doesn't really even like capitalization. So then in VS Code, because I've named it HTML, I can do an explanation and then a tab. And what that does is it creates the standard setup HTML for an HTML page, a web page. Now, by the way, if this completely makes like I've never seen it before, my CIT82 or any kind of introduction to HTML is probably a great idea here, okay? Now, the other thing I have turned on is autosave, and it's a great feature that I absolutely love. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to create another file, I'm going to call it app.js, and in that app.js, I'm going to say loading JS file. Okay, now I'm only doing that just so I can see something. I'm going to come back over to my index file. I'm going to type script. I'm going to hit tab here. And this is using a built-in system called Emmet to make coding HTML much easier. I'm going to call source equals, and then it's actually going to, VS Code's going to go, oh, hey, do you want to link this file? And I'm going to say, yeah. So you could do all of that without, you could type it all out, or you could use some of the tabs, learn some of this productivity stuff. So it's really, again, that's a great place to ask questions. Okay, so in here, just to make sure this all works, now I'm just going to load this file, this HTML file, into a browser. Now I could do this just by right-clicking and say reveal in Finder. I could totally do this, and then just double-click here and open it. Okay, and probably for you this round, that's probably a good way to do it. Okay, right-click, inspect, and then in here, and again, this will look different for you. But if you click on elements, and for me, I have my console here at the bottom, I see that message. Now there's nothing on the page yet, because I haven't written anything specific for the outputting to the page. That's where I will end in a few minutes, not end, but I will get to in a few minutes, okay? So you can do it this way, and then whenever you change code, actually let's just go do that, okay? So now in here, now I'm going to write a function. Now for our class, I want you to follow a particular style guide for writing functions. And you're going to learn this in a little while. At this point, you've learned the let, right? Variable declaration, or in this case, function declaration. But I'm going to show you const. He talks about it later, but it's just constant is a constant, meaning it's not going to change. So there, and that is the way I would determine, I'm going to say mileage. And actually, I'm going to say calculate mileage. Okay, now this is using that camel case of the first word, lowercase, second word, uppercase, typical coding style. And again, it's the way I want to see variables or function names. And I'm going to say it's a function. Okay, so this is just the signature, the way we write functions. Now, you're going to learn as we go through arrow functions, how to minimize this and different things and why we would use them. But for today, this is fine. Okay? So in this case, I have a function now. Now, there's nothing in here yet. But again, one of the things I hope you learn through Andrew's section 4 is really understanding the basic ideas around functions. They're basically units of code that you can rerun multiple times and have specific either inputs and outputs, or just runs this specific code. And I'm going to kind of build this example up. So I'm going to say in here, by the way, until I actually call calculate mileage and right, nothing actually happens in here. Even though there's nothing in here as well, nothing gets called inside of my code. So if I wanted to just do a quick, right, inside function, calculate mileage, I could do that. And then from here, if I switched over, and I'm going to do an alt tab real quick, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to refresh this, and notice now I get that, okay? And if I didn't include the call, okay, invoking the function, that wouldn't work. Now, I don't need this. I really don't need the other one. But let's say I could do let here. Let miles equals, let's say 150. Let's say let gallons For those of you still driving regular cars, sorry. For me, this calculation would be different because I would drive an electric car, but I think you get the idea. And then I can say let mileage equal to miles. And by the way, notice how it's trying to help me here, which is awesome. And the many different ways you can let the editor help you with autocomplete, it is a good thing, right? And then I can just say mileage, right? So this is just a standard function that we're writing. We're setting some variables inside of this. So this is scoped only to the inside of this function. I can't console log any of these variables outside of this function. They will not, they'll error out if I try to do that. But at this point, what do we think is going to happen, right? If we move over here, boom, okay? Now, I could at this point also just run this from the browser if I wanted to, right? So I could use the node, right? And I could call app.js. And oh, very good. So really important is to make sure you're in the right, and this is where I've shown you how to right click open an integrated terminal, and I hadn't done that. So I'm going to use my up arrows. Let's see if I don't have it. If you do have it in your command line, you can already do that. So I was just showing, okay. Right, so loading JS file, and then it outputs the mileage. Now, because we're hard coding into this function, the miles and the gallons, it's not quite as useful as we would probably want it to be. So now what we could do is change this to where we pass in, right? So this is the idea of understanding the difference between arguments and parameters. Let me just give you a visual for this because he talked about it. But so when you call a function, when you invoke a function, you set up arguments that then become parameters. Now, in this case, we're passing them as integers. We're then saying that integer 5 is going to be parm1, 6 is going to be parm2. Okay, so parameter 1 and 2 passed in. So when you're doing this, you can, when you define the arguments and parameters, you can name them different things. And it makes sense to name them different things because then it allows you to reuse this function, okay? So let's say, because I'm going to pass in 150 for mileage and 4 for gallons, I no longer need this, right? I would say miles, comma, gallons, okay? That's, I mean, and understanding that can come up for new programmers can really kind of just to wrap your head around. We could have called this anything. But in this case, we're calling it what it is, right? Cool. So it still would do the same thing. Again, I can either run it here, right? Or I can look at it in the browser by refreshing. Cool. Okay, so it's still running. It's running both on the command line and it's outputting in the browser. All right, so now let's actually take the next step here. Instead of console logging it out, and instead of setting up a variable, we could actually just do this. We could say return. And now there is some really important things to understand here. Because when we're calling it here, we're just passing in these arguments. They're becoming parameters. They're doing a calculation. But when you do a return, and I want you to do this in your stimulus, is then it's saying return that value. Well, you have to, in a sense, capture that value. So I could say let mileage equal. So now what's getting returned is actually going to be captured, or in this case assigned, because when this runs, passing this in, when it says return, then that value is going to be what is now equal to mileage. Now this is defined out on the global scope, and we'll talk about kind of trying to over time minimize some of your local and global scope. Typically you want not that much defined up in the global scope just because there's other reasons why we'll talk about as we get a little further into it, okay? So now that I have mileage here on the global scope, but I have it, first, any questions you have right there would be great to ask either on Discord or, coming into office hours, because when you get this concept, it's really powerful and you can use it in many different ways. But I'm just going to kind of continue and now kind of switch to how do I then look at this in DevTools, right? So I'm going to set up another function. I'm going to grab something real quick. Now I'm going to go over this later. Copy this. I'm going to go over this in a little more detail. And I'm going to say here, I'm going to determine another function that's going to display on page. So now I'm actually going to display it on page so that not only will I see it on my output page, and in order to do that, I have to do a div, and I have to say ID equal output. Cool. And the reason I have to do that is that my function here, which again we're going to learn about this in this course, actually needs that output div in order to create a new element called, in this case I'm creating a P, just drop that for a minute, which is a paragraph tag, and then I'm going to pass into it a message. Now, so what I can do here is now that I have that mileage, I could say display on page, and I'm going to pass mileage, which is just, now in this case, it's just a number. I could actually create some better content here, and I will, right? But now that I've done that, running it from here is going to throw an error. Is this going to be like document? That doesn't make sense because the document is related to the HTML. Okay, so I just want you to know I've had a couple of students run into that. And again, I'm transitioning to the browser before he is. Okay, so now what I want to do is go back to the browser. I'm going to refresh here. And now we see on the page that output of 37.5, which is the mileage. Okay? So I know this is a lot. Okay? Let me come back to you for a minute. Now, for some of you, that discussion was probably like, I got this, I understand it. For some of you, this is like still wrapping your head around what's going on when we're writing functions, when we're passing arguments into a function that become parameters, how we can change the name, but it still is the same value, how we can do some calculation and either return nothing or just don't do a return, or when we do, capturing that value, okay? So what I want to see you do, the reason I went through this, and I'm almost done, is I want you to think about when you're writing your functions for your refactor, and refactor is a term we use in coding where you're taking something you've done in one way and you're going to do it in another, and create functions. Now, I would love to see you do return values, but if that's like, I can't wrap my head around it right now, that's okay. Next time you're going to need to do that. Just because I know that there can be some challenges here, all right? So the last step I'm going to show you, and you're like, is this not enough? Is that when I do, let me just show you this. I'm going to come back here, okay? And now I'm going to go ahead and do my git add star, which adds both of those. I'm going to do my git commit message, and I'm going to say week 3 learn together, learning together. I could just do LT, makes it easier. Demo, okay? So now I've added it into my local repo, and I'm going to do a git push, and that pushes it out to GitHub, okay? So now, and here's the other reason I'm doing this, because you have been working on your local dev environment, and when you push your code out to public, we can use this wonderful little site to actually make it to where anyone can look at your particular code in the browser. And it's a really good way for us to be able to kind of help each other when we can see what your code's doing. And the important thing here, and going back here, is I want you to use the DevTools okay, because this is the last step I'm going to show you. Actually, over here, I could have shown you, but I'm still showing you this last part is so that we can see each other's code run in the browser without having to download your code into our system. Okay, so let me just show you this here. This is the one running on my local system. I'm going to do app, right? And here's the code that I've written. So if I wanted to do a breakpoint here and refresh the page, then I could use the dev tools. I can step into, right? Now, what's important here is to understand, like, why would I put the breakpoint here is like, this is where, right here, I've just defined things, but here I'm actually going to invoke something. So if I hit step, then I can see, and you can also see what's being passed into it. I can see there's a return, and when I step out of this is going to do a calculation, and now I can see that that is the value, and then you could actually walk through this, okay? Now, so I kind of switched there for a little bit, and I was showing you how to do it on mine, and you might wonder, well, how is this connected to our GitHub? Well, let me show you. I'm going to go into CIT93. I'm going to go into my repo, my public. I'm going to go into my, now for you, this would be just your W3. I'm going to do my index. I'm going to grab that, copy it. Now, all you have to do here is paste that, and then it's going to give you a URL that then renders on any web page. Okay, so I'm going to copy that there. Copy this. Now, I think I'm trying to remember why I'm using the URL for development, but that's what I'm doing. There was a reason. Yeah, I don't remember why. So in this case, I can give you all a link. Okay. So I'm going to give you, let's give it to you in here. Right. So, and then if I copy that and I say link, right. Now I could shorten that text down. Cool. So now what will happen is what you will get when you look at my written, you'll be able to actually bring that up in a browser, see that output, right click, inspect, go over to sources, and, oh yeah, looks like, let me just refresh real quick. Might have just been some kind of, so in this case, that can happen, mostly because it does it pretty quick. Sometimes there can be a delay on this Git hack thing. But I can see this, I can go in, click on my JS file, I can set that breakpoint, right? And then I can walk through, and I refresh it and walk through that code, okay? So this, all we're learning here is basically how to do the step, and you can also do F9 there. And here's, and I will end here. Let me come here. So I know this feels like several steps, but there's so many benefits to transitioning to the browser sooner rather than later, and DevTools is one of them, okay? So I've walked you through how to understand when you're writing code, and the moment you include code to handle putting output on a web page, running it from Node.js just throws errors. Right, but many of the code, and again, I think it's like a week or maybe 2 weeks away that he actually transitions to looking at the browser. But I just find it more helpful because it gives you that dev tool experience, and the sooner you understand how to see your code run, understand, it will help you write better code. Okay, so hopefully, I know I meandered a little bit there, but hopefully this gave you an understanding. Just to reiterate, refactor the stimulus code into at least 2 functions. If possible, attempt to do a return function that you then pass to another function. I'm gonna do the video for my stimulus refactor and walk through that concept. But for now, I just want you to be able to write a couple of functions that handle the stimulus, extending your code from last week, and learn DevTools. So when on the submit here, I've just reiterated the idea of attempt this code on your own, right? complete the GitHub workflow, and then your reply discuss any changes, or if you feel like now you have a better understanding of DevTools and why we're using it, or anything else maybe about the stimulus that you refactored. So just have a way that discusses kind of where your experience was in doing this. Okay, peace out.